Hello, my loves from the Secrets of Men channel. I never imagined that life could become so difficult to understand. I'm Will. I'm 35 years old, a lawyer in a small town called Riverton, Michigan. I grew up here, and I always thought it would be a peaceful place to build my life. But like every story, there's something turbulent about things we can't control, and sometimes the wind takes us where we shouldn't go. Today, I decided to take some time out of my life to tell you about a relationship I had with my father-in-law. So please subscribe to the channel and stay until the end so you don't miss any of the details. Alice and I got married almost 7 years ago. When we met, she was a literature teacher at the local college, someone who seemed to have her whole life planned out. She was so different from me, so full of plans and dreams. I, on the other hand, have never been the type to follow a script. I shaped myself over time, choosing the career my father wanted me to have, and never questioning it too much. I've always felt comfortable with the life we've built together, in a modest house in the city center, close to everything, but far enough away to have our privacy. It was a morning like any other when Alice told me that her father, Frank, was going to stay with us for a while. He was going through a difficult time with a financial crisis that caused him to lose his apartment. I understood his situation, but the idea of having him live with us indefinitely didn't appeal to me. I was already overloaded with work, and frankly, I was worried about the impact Frank's presence would have on our routine, but I couldn't refuse. Alice was worried and he needed help. So, with a forced smile, I said, "Okay." Frank arrived on a Friday afternoon. Alice and I were organizing the living room when he appeared at the door. There was something about the way he introduced himself. His gray hair, always neatly trimmed, contrasted with the slightly disheveled look of someone who has been through hard times. He looked older, but with the same penetrating gaze, as if he was always measuring the world around him. He wasn't rude, but his presence filled the room in a strange way. As he greeted me, I noticed a certain tension in his voice, as if he were trying to make peace with a complicated past. "It's good to see you. I didn't know what else to do," said Frank, putting his suitcase in the corner of the room. I nodded, trying to hide my discomfort. "Of course, Frank. Make yourself at home." Alice, on the other hand, was overjoyed. She was happy to have him back. She ran over to him, and the two exchanged a tight hug. Seeing her joy made me feel even more uncomfortable, as if something was wrong, but I didn't know exactly what it was. For the first few days, the routine continued more or less as before. Frank occupied the guest room upstairs. He seemed to be trying not to get in the way too much, and I tried to be cordial. However, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was changing in the air. The conversations, which at first were cordial, started to become more frequent between Frank and me, especially after Alice started spending more time at school, preparing for the end of the semester. In the evenings, the two of us would sit in the kitchen, sipping a beer, talking about what he called the old days, when he was at the height of his career as an entrepreneur. Although I didn't know much about those times, Frank's stories always seemed to have an undertone of bitter nostalgia. He complained about the end of his marriage, the loss of money, and even how life seemed lonelier and lonelier. In some of these conversations, I began to notice something curious. The way Frank talked about his ex-wife, his emotional distance from everything, made me think about my own life and my own choices. He seemed so disillusioned, and somehow there was something about her, about that disillusionment, that attracted me. It wasn't an attraction in the physical sense, but a connection of souls that over time I began to understand as something deeper. That Friday, while Alice was busy with a school event, Frank and I were alone at home. He was sitting in the kitchen, stirring his spoon in his coffee cup, his eyes fixed on the table. When he looked up at me, I sensed something different, something in the air. "Will," he said with a deeper tone, "I know you don't want to hear this, but have you ever felt trapped? Like your life has been shaped by other people?" I remained silent. The question kept echoing inside me. The truth was that yes, I did feel trapped. The life I had now with Alice, with work, seemed to be the life I should have, but not the one I wanted. I was never someone who took big risks. I was never someone who allowed myself to feel more than I had to. "I feel like that all the time," I replied. "But you know, there's Alice. She makes things seem easier and I love her." Frank watched me with a distant expression. Something in his eyes seemed to understand more than he was willing to say. He sighed and took a sip of his coffee. "You know, Will, life has a way of pushing us where we don't want to go. And sometimes we need a push to see what we really want." I didn't know what he meant by that, but something about the way he said it bothered me. At the same time, there was something in his words that touched a nerve in me. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt closer to Frank at that moment, more than I had with anyone else in my life. And it was at that moment, in the midst of the apparently casual conversation, that I began to notice a change in me. Something inside me stirred. It was as if a door had been ajar, and I was looking the wrong way, not really understanding what was going on. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I looked at Alice, who was already lying next to me, fast asleep. I wanted to feel the same connection with her as before, but there was something in my mind that kept me away. Something I didn't want to admit. What happened in that conversation with Frank seemed to haunt me, entangling me in a maze of conflicting emotions. But I knew I couldn't let it consume me. I had my life, my marriage, and I wasn't going to throw it all away for something so uncertain. But at the same time, a part of me began to doubt. I began to wonder if the life I had was really the one I wanted to live. The next few days were like a blur of routine, and at the same time, everything seemed clearer than ever. Something in my mind had changed, and I knew it. What had started out as an innocent conversation with Frank, a casual exchange of words in the kitchen, was turning into something more, something I couldn't control. Frank seemed more and more comfortable in the house. His presence was no longer just limited to the guest room. He was spreading out in the corners, as if he was already part of our lives, as if the house was his. At first, Alice seemed just happy to have him back. She was so focused on her own problems and responsibilities at work that she didn't notice, or perhaps didn't want to notice, the small changes that were beginning to happen between Frank and me. With each conversation, the tension between us grew. He had a way of looking at me that disconcerted me, as if he was trying to see something beyond the surface, as if he was challenging me to face my own truths, which I was trying to hide even from myself. It was a Thursday afternoon when things started to get more complicated. Alice was at a school meeting, and Frank and I were at home. I was in the living room, reading some files, when I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, wearing his wool sweater with a cup of coffee in his hand. "Are you busy?" he asked, his voice calm but with a tone that indicated something more, something deeper. "No, you can come in," I replied, trying not to look uncomfortable. But I knew I was lying. Ever since that conversation in the kitchen, everything between us seemed to be charged with a tension that was hard to explain. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I knew it was starting to change. He sat down on the sofa next to me, not with the formality of before, but in an almost casual way, as if he had done this a million times before. He put his coffee cup on the coffee table and looked me in the eye, more intensely than before. "You know, Will," he began, "it's not easy to go through such a big change in life. When everything you've built falls apart, you find yourself in a very strange place." I looked at him, a little surprised at the openness he was showing. Normally, Frank was the kind of man who kept his feelings under wraps, with a facade of strength. But there, in that moment, he seemed vulnerable, more so than any other moment I had witnessed. "I know what you mean," I replied, trying to disguise the strange sensation I was feeling. "But it's actually more complicated than that. Life isn't always simple, you know?" Frank nodded, his expression serious. He was silent for a moment, as if pondering my words, but didn't say anything for some time. The silence between us seemed to carry an immense weight. I could feel the air in the room thickening, and I didn't know how to break it. "You don't have to follow what others expect of you," Frank said, as if reading my thoughts. "I spent my whole life trying to please others, trying to be what they expected of me, and it destroyed me. Now I see how much I wasted." I took a deep breath, trying to process what he was saying. In some part of me, I knew that I was beginning to be attracted to his freedom of thought. Maybe it was the way he stripped himself of all the rigidity of life. Maybe it was the feeling of being in uncharted territory, but something in his words seemed to make sense. something I had never allowed myself to explore before. "But don't you think—" I hesitated. "I have a wife, and I love Alice. I can't just change everything overnight." Frank looked at me with his piercing eyes, and for a brief moment there was something there, a silent understanding, a kind of unspoken complicity. "You don't have to change everything, Will," he replied calmly. "Sometimes it's just a question of seeing things in a different way." I could no longer ignore what he was saying. I could no longer run away from what I was beginning to feel. Frank was pushing me into an emotional abyss, and with every word he said, the deeper I went. A part of me wanted to stop everything, wanted to run out and scream. But another part, the part I had never allowed to exist before, was starting to feel alive. At that moment, I realized that I was no longer just listening to advice. I was hearing a kind of invitation, a door ajar to something else, something that awakened in me a sense of desire I had never experienced before. I knew what was happening, but I couldn't stop. From that day on, our interaction became even more intimate, but in a subtle way. We started spending more time together, working in the garden, watching soccer matches on TV. I knew something was going on, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. It was as if, somewhere in the back of my mind, I already knew what was going on. And yet, I couldn't stop. The little exchanges of glances, the gestures that were once innocent, began to take on another dimension. I spent more time watching Frank than I did with Alice. I found myself admiring the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he seemed to understand something I couldn't yet understand about myself. One afternoon in particular, stuck in my memory. It was a hot Friday and the house was silent. Alice was out, and I was reading a work report when Frank entered the room, as if he knew exactly what was going on inside me. He sat down next to me, but this time there were no words. He just looked at me, his eyes fixed, as if he was waiting for something. I felt the weight of the silence, and suddenly he moved closer. It wasn't fast, it wasn't an aggressive or impetuous movement, but there was a tension in the air, something electric. The way he looked at me, the way he leaned forward slightly, it all made me lose my composure. It was at that moment that things changed. There was no turning back. Time seems to pass differently when you're lost. At that time, the weeks dragged by, and at the same time, I felt like I was living in a state of suspension, as if my life was being pushed by an invisible current towards a destination that I could neither avoid nor understand. The summer heat had begun to dissipate, but there was still that dense humidity in the air, typical of Michigan, which made everything seem stuffy, heavier than it really was. Sometimes, as I left for work, I would stop on the porch, smelling the wet grass and hearing the distant sound of children playing in the street. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't detach myself from what was happening inside my own home. The shadows of what I was beginning to realize about myself, about what was happening to Frank, and about what I was failing to do, consumed me. Alice was becoming more and more absorbed in her work. She spent her evenings correcting exams or preparing lessons for the new semester. I had always respected her dedication, but over time I realized that the distance between us was becoming more than just physical. It was as if, somewhere deep down, she also knew that something wasn't right. Perhaps she had noticed how much Frank and I were spending time together. Perhaps she had noticed that my attention was more on him than on her. But Alice never questioned it. She had an unshakable confidence in me, and it ate away at me. Frank, on the other hand, seemed more and more comfortable in the house, as if he was staying permanently. He continued to approach me, with his calm and measured manner, always with that deep look in his eye that seemed to understand more than I wanted to reveal. The conversations began to intensify. Sometimes in the late afternoon, after dinner, he would come up to me and suggest a walk down to the lake. I knew it was an excuse to get away from the house, to be alone, without Alice present, without anyone seeing us. That Friday, the feeling of being on the brink of something big, something inevitable, became almost unbearable. The sun was already setting, painting the sky a deep orange, and I was in the living room, watching the reflection of the light in the windows. The sound of the wind in the tree in the backyard seemed distant, and Frank's footsteps echoed in the hallway, a soft but steady rhythm. I knew he was approaching, and for some reason my heart raced. There was no longer a clear division between right and wrong. There was no longer a thread of sanity keeping me from what I was beginning to crave. Something on your mind, Will? Frank's voice sounded from next door, and I jumped as if caught red-handed. He always knew when something was bothering me. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't know what to say. It was as if all the words, all the explanations, had been ripped out of me. What could I say? That I was losing myself? That guilt was consuming me, but that at the same time there was something in me that didn't want to stop. I don't know. I was just thinking, I replied, my voice weaker than I would have liked. Frank was silent for a moment, looking at me with those piercing eyes. He didn't sit down, he didn't make a move. He just stood there, as if waiting for me to say something more, as if he knew exactly what was going on inside me. Haven't you ever thought about changing, Will? Really changing your life? Doing what you want to do instead of following what's expected of you? The question was simple, but the intensity with which he asked it made my stomach turn. I knew he was talking about something deeper, something that went beyond a simple change of profession or location. He was talking about internal change, about freeing ourselves from the invisible ties that bind us to our lives, our morality, and our choices. I started to speak, but my voice failed me. I was afraid to go any deeper, afraid of what I might discover if I really asked that question. I love Alice, Frank. I love my life with her. I can't... He interrupted me with a gesture. Life isn't all about what you think is right, Will. Sometimes we get lost in what we think we have to do and forget what we really feel. I'm not saying you should change your life forever, but maybe you need to start understanding what you really want. I knew he was challenging me, but I also knew that what he was saying made sense. Something inside me stirred. I was beginning to understand that it wasn't just a simple attraction, a passing thing. There was something deeper. I wanted something more. I needed something more. That's when he took a step closer to me, so close that I could feel the warmth of his body. The smell of coffee was still on his clothes, mixed with the faint scent of tobacco that he smoked from time to time. Do you think she'll never know, Will? She will. People know when things change. They feel it. His words fell like a sentence. I didn't want to hear it, but I knew he was right. Alice was already starting to notice. I could feel it. She already knew, but she didn't want to see. Perhaps she was refusing to see. She trusted me so much that she didn't want to admit the pain of a betrayal that hadn't actually happened yet. But the mere fact that I was there, with Frank, with him so close to me, was already a form of betrayal. It was already a mistake. On an impulse, Frank put his hand on my shoulder. The sensation of his touch disconcerted me so much that, for a moment, I was paralyzed. It was as if time had stopped there, at the very moment when the line between right and wrong dissolved. I knew there was no turning back. I knew that in that touch there was something more, something that couldn't be denied. You don't have to do anything, Will. You just have to decide. The rest will come. Then he kissed me and slowly pulled away, but I could still feel the warmth of his hand on my shoulder. Something inside me, some primitive part, was screaming at me to stop, to get away from there. But the other part, the part that felt lost and alone, was telling me to keep going, not to look back. But at that moment, the kitchen door opened and Alice appeared. Her normally calm face was filled with an expression I didn't recognize. She looked at me, and then at Frank. The silence that fell between us was heavy, laden with something that didn't need to be said. "Everything okay?" Alice asked, her voice tense, but with a superficial calm. I swallowed. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to tell her what was happening to me. "Yes, we were just talking," I said, my voice almost cracking. Alice looked at both of us, her eyes quick and penetrating, as if she was trying to figure something out. She hesitated for a moment, but then smiled forlornly and said, "Right, I'll get dinner ready." She turned, walking back into the kitchen, but her presence, her lack of confidence now, hit me like a punch in the gut. And at that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The next few days passed uneasily. Time seemed to stretch out, but every second I spent indoors felt like an increasingly unbearable weight. Frank's presence seemed to be a constant shadow over me, and at the same time, my relationship with Alice began to dissolve into silence. I knew that what we were experiencing, Frank and I, wasn't something that could continue for much longer. This tension, this closeness that now surrounded us, was about to explode in some form of revelation. But at the same time, I didn't know how to get out of it. There was something in me that wanted the truth to come out, that wanted to confess everything to Alice, but another part, a part of me that had never existed before, pushed me to continue, to explore what was happening, even though I knew it would destroy me. That Monday morning, when the sun was still low on the horizon, I woke up with my heart racing. The silence in the house was heavier than usual. Alice was still sleeping next to me, her body turned to the side, as if she was unaware of everything that was happening around us. I watched her, trying to understand what I still felt for her. There was love there, no doubt, but also a strange sense of detachment. Something had changed, and I didn't know if I could go back. I slowly got out of bed, taking care not to wake her, and went out into the hallway. The house was silent, and the smell of coffee was already beginning to invade the air from the kitchen. Frank was there, as always, with his constant presence. He seemed more at home than ever. When I walked into the kitchen, he was sitting at the table, cup of coffee in front of him, staring into nothingness. He watched me for a moment before speaking, as if he had been waiting for me. "Are you all right, Will?" he asked, his voice deep but with a gentle tone. He knew something was happening. He knew I was fighting against what I felt, against what was already between us. "I don't know." My voice faltered. I was tired of lying to myself. I knew I couldn't go on ignoring what was happening. Frank watched my reaction, and instead of answering immediately, got up and walked over to the window. He stood there for a while, looking out at the garden. I knew he was waiting for something, a reaction from me, a decision. "I'm not a perfect man, Will," he said, slowly turning to face me. "But I know what it's like to feel trapped, and I know you're trying to escape it." I approached the table, taking a seat facing him. His presence bothered me, but at the same time, there was something there that I could no longer ignore. He was right. I felt trapped, but stuck to what? The marriage I had built? To the life I thought I wanted, but which now felt like a prison. "I don't know what to do anymore, Frank." I didn't know if I was talking to him or to myself. "I know I'm doing something wrong, but part of me doesn't want to stop." He sighed, as if he had been waiting for this confession, as if he already knew what was going on inside me. He came closer, placed a hand on the table, as if trying to convey a calm that I couldn't feel. "You don't have to do anything, Will. You just need to be honest with yourself. It's your choice. I'm not here to force anything. I'm just here to let you see what's going on inside you." Those words hit me hard. He wasn't pushing me. He was calmly showing me what was going on. But how could I be honest with myself? How could I understand what I really wanted? It was then that I forgot all the thoughts in my mind and went towards him to kiss him. At that moment, the front door opened and Alice entered the room. She was carrying a bag, probably on her way to work, and when she saw me sitting with Frank, she stopped in the doorway, looking at both of us with an expression I couldn't read. "Good morning, Alice," Frank said with a calm smile. Alice nodded but didn't look as cheerful as usual. She looked at me and then at Frank, her eyes narrowing for a moment, as if trying to understand the dynamic between the two of us. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tense although she tried to disguise it. I didn't know what to say. I knew what was happening, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't find the right words to tell her what was already clear between us. I was being consumed by a lie, and she felt it. I could see it in her gaze. "Yes, we're just talking about some things," I said, trying to sound casual, but the flaw in my voice gave away the truth. Alice paused, and for a moment it seemed as if she wanted to say something else, something that I knew could change everything, but she just sighed, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked into the kitchen without saying another word. Her behavior was strange. She was walking away, as if she had already noticed the breakup, but didn't want to face it. I followed her into the kitchen, where she started preparing breakfast without a word. Frank was silent, but his eyes were fixed on me, watching, analyzing everything. I knew that he saw Alice's pain, and I also knew that he understood what it meant to me. But that wasn't what I wanted to see. I didn't want to see Alice's pain. I wanted to see my own pain being dissolved. I wanted to find some form of redemption, Or perhaps just an excuse to continue living in this chaos. "Alice," I finally said, my voice weak, almost desperate. I know things are different, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to deal with all this." She stopped, spatula still in hand, and looked at me. Her gaze was mixed with frustration and sadness. She didn't answer me straight away. Instead, she looked at Frank, as if expecting a response from him. And at that moment, I knew that she knew. She knew everything. "I'm going to work," Alice said, with a coldness I didn't recognize. She left the kitchen without saying another word, leaving me with a weight on my back that seemed unbearable. The door closed behind her, and the house fell silent. Frank didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at me, waiting for me to find an answer. He was no longer trying to convince me of anything. He knew that the choice had been made, and that, at some point, I would have to take the consequences. I sat at the table, my head between my hands, trying to process everything that had happened. I was on the verge of losing everything. And even more frightening, part of me didn't know if I cared. Part of me was ready to move on, to cross that invisible line and see where it would take me. But deep down, a small voice inside me was still screaming to stop. It was screaming to save what was left. But what was left? I didn't know anymore. After that tense morning when the words between me, Frank, and Alice seemed about to explode, something inside me ignited. I knew I was at breaking point. The life I knew, with Alice, the woman I loved, was crumbling around me. But at the same time, a tiny thread of hope began to shine through the darkness. The truth, or whatever the truth was at that moment, didn't lie in being completely honest about what was happening between Frank and me, but in looking at myself and reflecting, what did I really want? It was then that Frank asked me what we were going to do, and I just said, "It's your last day here. Do you want to go to the bedroom and finish what we started?" He agreed, and we headed off. So what happened stayed in that room, and we promised never to tell my wife. The next day without Frank started differently. I woke up before Alice, on a rare morning when the house was completely silent. I looked at her, still asleep next to me, and something deep inside me touched me. I remembered how much I loved her, how precious the relationship we had built was. The mistakes, the flaws, they were all part of us, but I knew I didn't want the mistake of now to define the end. I got up slowly and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Something simple, but with the intention of showing that I wanted to change, that there was still a desire in me to win back what was being lost. When Alice came downstairs, the soft morning light flooded into the house, illuminating her tired but still beautiful face. She looked at me with a soft smile, but there was an uncertainty in her eyes, an unspoken question that hung between us. "Good morning," she said, with a lightness in her tone, but also a caution in her gaze. "Good morning," I replied, trying to convey a calm that I didn't yet fully feel. "I've made coffee. I thought we could have it together." She hesitated for a moment, but approached the table. She sat down, and the initial silence was broken by the aroma of coffee, and gradually, we began to talk about the trivial: work, home, the future. I knew that the conversation needed to go deeper, that we needed to talk about what was really going on, but I also knew that this wasn't the time. There was an abyss of silence between us, but I felt that the first step to healing it was to reconnect the threads of our daily lives. Over the course of the morning, Alice seemed to relax, more than I had expected. She even asked me about something I had said at work the night before, something she was curious to know. What struck me was not the question itself, but the fact that she was willing to talk, to regain some of the spontaneity we used to have. It was as if she was somehow trying to bring us back to who we were. She was surrendering to our routine, and that, for me, was a sign that there was still something there, something that could be saved. In the afternoon after work, I invited her for a walk in the park. It wasn't something grand, but it was a gesture that, on some level, showed how much I wanted to invest in our relationship. Alice agreed without hesitation, and we walked side by side along the tree-lined path. The silence between us was comfortable, as if we were gradually filling in the gaps left by unspoken words. On the way home, as the sun began to set, she spoke. "You know, Will, I was thinking, I think we've been distant for a while. It's not just you. I think I also got carried away by routine, by work. I got so immersed in the things I thought were important that maybe I forgot about both of us. I looked at her, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because she was recognizing something I felt, but sadness because the distance between us was, in fact, much greater than I wanted to admit. "I've been carried away by a lot too, Alice," I replied, trying to find the right words. "And I'm trying to understand how to bring you back to me. It's not easy, but I want to try. I want to try to make it right." She paused for a moment, as if reflecting on what I had said. When she looked at me again, her gaze was softer, but there was still a hesitation, as if she was waiting for something, waiting for a clear sign that I was committed to changing, to really being there for her. "I don't know what happened to us, Will," she finally said, with a slight sadness, "but I think we need time, maybe even more patience than we thought we needed. I don't want our relationship to be built only on what's gone before. I want a fresh start, even if it takes time." Those words, so simple, touched me deeply. I knew that she still didn't know everything, that the truth I carried inside me hadn't been revealed, but there was something there in that moment that made me see what really mattered. The two of us, together, trying to mend what was broken. She was willing to rebuild, and that gave me the motivation to try too. Not to hide the truth, but to find a way to be more honest with myself and with her, even if it wasn't necessary to expose all the details. In the days that followed, I made a silent but firm decision. It didn't matter what had happened between Frank and me. What mattered was that I was distancing myself from what was driving me away from Alice. The guilt I felt began to dissipate when I saw the effort she was also making to get better. We started talking more, laughing more, listening to each other more, and little by little, our relationship began to rebuild. Not as it was before, but with a new understanding that even when we lose each other, we can find each other again. The truth is that the change didn't happen overnight. There was no great revelation or dramatic confrontation. The change happened gradually, in the way we looked at each other, in the way we started to support each other more, to communicate more. It was constant work, but work that paid off. I knew that there was still something between us that needed to be overcome, something that might never be fully resolved, but that we could deal with together. Because in the end, what mattered was that we both still wanted to be there for each other. And that, for me, was enough. That was the story, my loves. What did you think? Leave a comment. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel by activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Bye-bye.